Next slide, please, Derek. So our ERP initiative really broke down into two main phases, the selection process and, of course, the implementation. Our selection process was very detailed and strategically planned. We did use Deloitte in actually the entire selection process to help us through. So what we did initially is went through a high-level assessment of our requirements, tried to figure out, what are we trying to accomplish, what processes, what do we need out of any sort of system that we're going to put in place. Deloitte assisted us with identification of which ERP providers we should be looking at, knowing that we're more of a mid-market type company. We didn't want to go too big, so we didn't necessarily want to be going with SAP, but we also didn't want to go too small so that we were, shooting ourselves in the foot down the road. We then pursued or moved forward to developing our RFP, sending that out to the vendors and getting them to respond. After that, we coordinated some vendor demos that were process-based, so it was going through the end-to-end scenarios that our business holds, getting them to show us how each of the systems would work, and doing an evaluation based on the demos, based on, of course, cost, and coming out with a solution. Once we selected the ERP provider that we were going with, again, we asked Deloitte to identify partners that would be suitable for us to proceed with the implementation process. Again, they identified 3 implementation partners that we, again, sent out RFP type document to, where we, again, evaluated and came to the solution that Ideaca was our ideal partner to be working with. Once we had selected Ideaca as our partner, we then did one more final step in kind of the assessment process by going in and trying to do a quick assessment of the scope for the implementation so that we would have a clear idea of what we're talking about when we were developing the work order with them from a cost and time perspective. The implementation process was broken down into 2 phases, one for the U.S. operations and one for Canada. Really, the U.S. operations implementation began in about June 2009. We went live there in January of 2010. So it was a heavy 6 months. We decided to go with the U.S. first because they were running a legacy Epicor system prior to that point. Although it was 20 years old, it still was an ERP, and therefore they were familiar with how an ERP works, as well as had built processes that fit with an ERP model. So we were hoping, by going with the U.S. first, we could model our processes in AX using maybe 75 to 80% of what they already did. Our initial step was to blueprint it out and define what our end-to-end processes were that were in the scope of the project, identify any of the workflow requirements that were required, so any type of online approvals that we needed, and we did some identification of high-level reporting that we thought we were going to need based on what we had before. We found that quite difficult only because we didn't know exactly what we were going to get out of the system yet. So trying to come up with really predefined reporting requirements seemed to be tough, but we tried to get some there. We then moved forward into our build, which was basically configuration of our system, each of the modules, to meet the needs of those end-to-end processes that were in the scope. Of course, a great deal of unit testing in each of the modules to make sure all of the steps and processes worked. Then we, each of the builds, we had basically 3 cycles whereby we would configure and do implementation tests, which was testing all of those end-to-end cycles using test scripts that we had written, documenting each of the results, whether things passed each of the steps and not. And then after each of those cycles, we would go back, make changes as necessary, and of course come to cycle 2, cycle 3. We also did a bit of load testing on our system prior to or during that build process, as we wanted to ensure that the hardware was functioning, hardware and of course the database was functioning as we desired, so that once we rolled it out to our end users, they weren't going to be facing performance issues just to use the system. And really the final step in the build process was the beginning of the load of master data. So really we tried to knock some of that out earlier in the process rather than leaving it all to the end. The stuff like customers, vendors, items for your inventory, bills of materials, routes, employees, historical GL balances, whatever we had at the time that we knew was clean, we tried to get in there sooner than later, just to make it a lot easier for us when going into the go live phase. Our implementation phase was really training end users, which of course is extremely important when you're going to any new system. We essentially, for both the Canadian and the US rollouts, we gathered end users in centralized locations so as to, number one, minimize the number of training sessions that were needed, but also to have those users gain some value from being able to hear questions or talk with their peers as they were going through the training sessions. Then as part of the implementation step, we performed our data cutover, so things like our open AP invoices, open POs, our final GL balances, inventory balances, both from a quantity and dollar perspective for finished goods, raw materials, and then of course our WIP type of stuff such as open work orders, open projects. And then the big step of the go live where everybody cheers or starts screaming at you, one or the other. Past that, of course, you have your stabilization phase, and this one, you may think it's fairly simple, but it's really not. I can't underestimate how involved the support process really is after you go live. Even though all those users have been trained, it's still support. We had approximately 8 individuals, I think, available supporting on nearly a full-time basis for probably 3 months after each one of the implementations. Yes, that does go down over time, but it's still there to date, quite honestly, but not in as drastic or heavy load. Also in the stabilization phase, we've now continued to develop our reporting. So now that we see some of the stuff that is coming out of the system or is available in the system, we're more easily able to identify that those are the types of things that we want to grab and pull into report formats. And of course, we continue to resolve system issues as they arise. Even though you go through the process of testing and blueprinting and all that and training, you still run into things from time to time in the business that something just isn't working right, and of course got to deal with it as you can. Next scope, please, Derek. Our ERP scope was actually quite broad. The modules that we use in AX right now include finance, inventory management, purchasing, production, projects. Shop floor and time collection are kind of two that are intertwined. Shop floor is one of the AX modules. Time collection is more of an add-on that we've used in our implementation that I'll talk about a little bit more in an upcoming slide. We also use one more module that actually isn't here, but it's tied in with the production module, and that's called Product Builder. Our business processes, again, I spoke to a few of these a little bit earlier, but the make to stock, configure to order, engineer to order, procurement, field service, which is our stuff like going out and performing some warranty work or some of our tank lining jobs that we do, time to pay, and again, the close. Right now, in Dynamics AX, we have 76 concurrent user licenses and 400 shop floor licenses, which are used for the terminals that are out on the floor for employees, hourly employees, to log their time. So some of the streamlining, again, that we've gone through and realized is with the shop floor time capture. Our employees, each of our plants has anywhere from 2 to 4 of intermech terminals that are out on the shop floor. These are network connected and tie back to our AX database. They're running a product or a software named Dynaway Job in Time, which is from a provider out of Denmark actually, that allows our employees on the floor to clock in using scanning barcode cards for each employee. They scan on each of the jobs that they're working on, whether they're working on a production job, a project, or an indirect activity. They also scan in and out for their coffee breaks and lunch breaks. So it's very nice in that the time that is captured via these units transmits back to AX almost immediately. Of course, there's a bit of a synchronization process that happens, and there's also a process in the back that happens to make sure that all of the terminals are kind of talking in unison with one another, so that the information that comes back into AX isn't garbled if one employee is using multiple terminals at a time. The information that comes back in is then viewable by our supervisors for review, and it also allows us to create reports, some using standard AX, others using customized reports that we've built to then put into our ADP payroll system. Right now we are doing that step still a little bit manually in that it is keyed in, but we are in the process actually of pursuing creating the export file to upload directly to our payroll provider so that we can eliminate that process. Job costing, as I mentioned, was one of the key goals, and that has been realized. So both on production orders and projects, we now have the ability to say, okay, how much did this one specific tank cost us, both on the labor side and the material side, and then compare that back against the standard cost of that tank or against other tanks of its type. Also on the project side, we're now very easily able to capture all the costs of any project, both whether it's materials, labor, expenses, anything of that nature, put it into a bucket effectively and compare that against our budgets or against other projects. We've, as mentioned before, we've implemented some workflows and approvals directly in the AX system. So on the purchasing side, depending on the type of item that you're buying, there are limits as to the dollar values that buyers can purchase up to. Once they exceed those values, of course, it proceeds up the chain within management and sends automated notifications both in the AX system as well as via email to those individuals that approval is required on a purchase order. On the sales side, we've also implemented workflow around our credit checking processes. And in the U.S., we also use a process around discounting that is provided to our customers on their orders. Our customers receive varying levels of discounts, and so that was a key piece of our approval for sales. Finally, time, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the shop floor supervisors now have the ability to review and approve time directly in the system, and the system tracks any changes that they make and then tracks the fact that they have approved it and said that it is good for payroll processing. Top to bottom financial visibility and reporting, of course, because of the fact that we now are all on one system, whether you're in Hagerstown, Maryland, or in Edmonton or Drummondville, we're using the same chart of accounts, same costing structure, same everything, so that we can now get a visibility into what each of our divisions is doing, both from a sales and costing perspective, and then use that for comparability, and of course then allow that information to be rolled up for consolidation. And so, that leads into the fact that our information is now shared virtually across the entire organization. Depending on your security roles, you have the ability to see varying pieces of information, but executive type level individuals, controllers have the ability to look at information across the organization.